I came to pick up our child from kindergarten, and then I saw my wife standing close to some man. Their body language, her hand on his arm. She kissed the man passionately. Him. I didn't know who he was at the time, but what I found out later shocked me to my core. And that's not all. They thought I was weak, but later she begged me for mercy. This story didn't just involve 3 people, it changed the lives of many others. It's a story about terrifying secrets you'd never suspect. It's a story about how, even without red flags, there's still a chance you're being betrayed. And it's also a story about what maybe shouldn't have been done. But I did it, consumed by rage and uncontrollable fury. I literally made my wife disappear. But let's start from the beginning. From the outside, my life looked perfect. The kind of life men worked decades to build. A sprawling home in the suburbs, a thriving career I'd built with my own hands, and a family that turned heads at every holiday gathering. My wife, Francesca, was the sort of woman who made people envy me. A beautiful, spirited partner who seemed to dote on me and our son, Noah. At 5 years old, Noah was the mirror image of everything I wanted in this world. Bright, curious, and endlessly affectionate. And yet, there was something uneasy in the undercurrent of my world. A fissure in the foundation I hadn't yet acknowledged. Francesca's enthusiasm for life had always been one of her most endearing qualities. She threw herself into motherhood with the same zeal she'd once put into our marriage, eagerly organizing playdates, decorating for holidays, and attending every parent meeting as if her life depended on it. For years, I admired her devotion to Noah. But recently, that same zeal had begun to feel suffocating. The parents' committee at Noah's daycare became her new obsession. It started small, an occasional meeting or a phone call with a teacher. But soon it consumed her days. Discussions about fundraising events, group outings, and elaborate activity plans took precedence over everything else. I'd come home from work to find her huddled over her laptop, typing furiously or on the phone with another parent. Her voice animated in ways I hadn't heard in years. At first, I dismissed it. She was just being a good mother. Wasn't that something I should appreciate? Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing frustration that grew with each passing week. It wasn't just the time she spent. It was her attitude. The way she brushed off my questions about her day with vague answers or changed the subject when I tried to suggest she slow down. My evenings had grown quieter, lonelier. I'd sit at the dinner table with Noah, listening to him chatter about his day while Francesca flitted around, distracted by her next committee obligation. When I asked her to join us, she'd wave me off with an apologetic smile, promising she'd eat later. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking it. After all, wasn't this the life I'd wanted? Stability, order, the ability to provide for my family without worry. And yet, in the quiet moments, the silence between Francesca and me felt too loud. It wasn't just the committee. It was something else. A distance that didn't exist before. Some nights, I'd sit in Noah's room after tucking him in, watching him sleep. It grounded me in ways nothing else could. The rise and fall of his small chest, the peaceful expression on his face. It reminded me of what I was fighting for. My family, my son. But beneath the calm, the questions lingered. Why was Francesca so busy? Why did her world suddenly revolve around people I didn't know? And why, in the deepest part of me, did I feel like I was losing something I couldn't name? I pushed the thoughts aside, convincing myself it was paranoia. But the unease remained, waiting for the moment it would become impossible to ignore. Francesca's committee work began creeping into every corner of our lives. Meetings stretched late into the evenings, and her phone was always in her hand, buzzing with messages from other parents. She seemed thrilled by it all, but the enthusiasm grated on me. The house felt emptier without her presence. I'd sit with Noah during dinner while Francesca was out, or hear her upstairs on yet another call as I cleaned up for the night. She no longer seemed tethered to us, her focus always drifting to the next event or fundraiser. Whenever I asked if it was too much, she waved me off, saying she was doing it for the kids. Maybe she was, but the constant busyness felt excessive, almost obsessive. I dismissed my irritation, telling myself it was harmless. Still, the growing distance between us gnawed at something I couldn't quite name. It was an evening like so many others. Noah nestled beside me, his small voice stumbling over the sentences in his book as I guided him through the tricky words. I enjoyed these moments with him, the simplicity of them. But that night, one offhand comment broke the rhythm. He mentioned someone had picked him up from daycare when I was busy. Not me, not Francesca. Someone else. I paused but kept my voice steady, asking for more details. Noah, oblivious to the tension his words caused, casually explained that Mommy had a friend who sometimes helped. He didn't elaborate further, nor did I press him. He was too young to understand the weight of what he'd just said. Later, I found Francesca at her usual spot, hunched over her laptop, typing furiously while her phone buzzed with messages. She didn't even look up when I walked in. When I asked her about it, her answer came so quickly it felt rehearsed. She said it was just another parent from the committee, someone stepping in to help during a busy day. She made it sound so ordinary, so innocent, that I almost let it go. Almost. But something about her tone didn't sit right. It was too casual, too dismissive. And the way she barely glanced at me as she spoke, it felt calculated, like she was already onto the next task, confident I wouldn't press further. I didn't. There wasn't enough to confront her, and Francesca was skilled at deflecting anything that could lead to an argument. Still, the unease settled in my chest like a weight. Who was this friend? Why hadn't she mentioned it before? That night, as I lay in bed, the house silent around me, I replayed the conversation in my head. Francesca's answer might have been convincing to anyone else, but I knew her too well. Something wasn't adding up. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't forget. It was one of those days where everything seemed to conspire against me. My phone had died halfway through the afternoon, leaving me cut off from any calls or messages. I couldn't reach Francesca to confirm if she was picking up Noah, and as the clock ticked closer to the end of daycare hours, I decided to leave work early and go myself. The drive to the daycare was uneventful, but as I turned into the parking lot, I spotted Francesca near the entrance. Relief flickered briefly. At least one of us had remembered. But then I saw him. She was standing too close to an unfamiliar man. Her hand rested lightly on his arm as they leaned toward each other, their laughter ringing out like a private joke. There was something intimate about the way they moved together, something I couldn't ignore. I stayed in the car, watching. A small part of me told me I was being ridiculous, that there could be a perfectly logical explanation. But before I could even finish that thought, Francesca leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a fleeting peck. It was slow, deliberate, passionate. I felt my stomach drop. The scene played out in front of me like something from a nightmare, the laughter of children in the background making it even more surreal. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Who was he? How long had this been going on? For a moment, I thought about confronting her, about marching over and demanding answers. But then I remembered Noah. This wasn't the time or place. He didn't deserve to be caught in the fallout. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the car into a space, straightened my face, and walked into the daycare as if nothing had happened. Noah greeted me with his usual enthusiasm, and I made sure my tone was steady as I chatted with his teacher. On the way out, Francesca spotted us. She smiled brightly, calling out a casual greeting as if the last few minutes hadn't happened. I kept my responses short, nodding while I buckled Noah into his seat. Driving away, my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they needed to. The image of Francesca and the stranger burned in my mind, her laughter and that kiss looping on repeat. My heart was pounding, but my thoughts were clear. I didn't know who the man was, but I would. And when I did, there would be no escaping the truth. The drive home felt endless. Every glance at Noah in the rearview mirror reminded me why I couldn't explode. Not yet. I needed to be smart about this, not impulsive. By the time we got home, I'd buried the raw edge of my anger beneath a calm mask. Francesca greeted us at the door, her usual cheerful self, fussing over Noah as though her day had been nothing out of the ordinary. I stayed quiet, observing her closely as she floated through the evening routine. She was too bright, too animated, like a performer hitting all her marks. At the dinner table, she laughed easily, filling the room with stories about the daycare committee's plans for a fundraiser. It was all so smooth, so natural, that anyone else would have been fooled. But I wasn't anyone else. I'd seen her. When the opportunity presented itself, I asked casually about her day. She didn't even flinch. She went on about productive meetings and how the committee was finalizing plans for the next event. The lie came so effortlessly it was almost impressive. I nodded along, my face giving nothing away. I didn't mention the man. I didn't mention the kiss. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not until I had more. Instead, I started watching her. That evening, after Noah went to bed, Francesca retreated to her usual spot at the dining table, her laptop open and her phone buzzing with messages. From the outside, it looked like every other night, but now I paid closer attention. The way she angled the screen away when I walked by, the little smile she gave while typing something, the way her phone never left her side, even when she got up for a glass of water. She thought she was clever. She thought she was careful. But she underestimated me. I didn't press her that night. I let her think she'd gotten away with it, that her performance had been flawless. Inside, though, my resolve hardened. I would find out who he was, how long this had been going on, and how deep her lies ran. The Cold War had begun, and I wasn't planning to lose. By the next evening, the weight of what I'd seen had become unbearable. Every glance at Francesca, every forced smile she threw my way, only sharpened my anger. She carried on as though nothing had happened, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. After Noah was asleep, I found her in the kitchen. She was scrolling through her phone, her face lit with a faint, contented smile that made my blood boil. I didn't plan to confront her that night, but the words came before I could stop them. "I saw you yesterday," I said, my voice low and steady. Her head snapped up, her eyes widening for the briefest moment before she masked it with confusion. "What are you talking about?" "At the daycare," I said, holding her gaze. "I saw you with him." Her reaction was immediate. She laughed. A sharp, incredulous sound that was more defensive than amused. "Pete, you're being ridiculous. There's nothing to see." I took a step closer, my voice firm. "You kissed him, Francesca. I watched you. Don't insult me by pretending it didn't happen." That's when the hysteria started. She shook her head vehemently, her voice rising as she accused me of misunderstanding, of twisting an innocent moment into something it wasn't. She said I was paranoid, that my imagination was running wild because of how stressed I was from work. I didn't waver. I stood there, silent and unmoving, as her deflections grew more desperate. When she realized I wasn't buying her excuses, she pivoted, turning the blame on me. "You're controlling Pete," she shouted, her voice shaking. "You always assume the worst. I can't even have a friend without you jumping to conclusions." Her lies were infuriating, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply stared at her, watching as she unraveled. The harder she tried to convince me, the more obvious it became that she was guilty. By the end of it, she was in tears, alternating between rage and self-pity. She claimed she couldn't believe I'd accuse her of something so horrible, that she'd been nothing but devoted to our family. Her words felt like a cruel joke. I didn't press further. There was no point. Francesca was never going to admit the truth, not willingly. As I walked away, her sobs echoed faintly behind me, but I felt nothing but cold determination. I didn't need her confession. I had seen enough to know. If she wouldn't give me answers, I would find them myself. And I would start with the man she kissed. The man's face stayed with me, burned into my memory. He was tall, confident, and had a way of leaning into Francesca as if he belonged there. There was nothing remarkable about him, yet everything about his presence felt deliberate, comfortable in a way that came from familiarity. As I lay awake that night, replaying the scene in my mind, I realized I didn't know where to begin. I had no name, no connection, just an image of him in my head and the certainty that he was part of Francesca's life. The next day, I started looking for answers. Francesca's routines were predictable, and her overconfidence made her careless. She left her phone on the counter while she made lunch, oblivious to the fact that I was watching her every move. When she stepped out of the kitchen to grab something from the laundry room, I took my chance. Her phone wasn't locked, an oversight she would regret. I scrolled quickly, looking for anything unusual. Most of the messages were from daycare parents or committee members, filled with mundane chatter about events and schedules. But then I saw it, a string of texts from an unsaved number. The conversation was sparse but unmistakably flirtatious. "Yesterday was amazing. You looked beautiful as always. Same time next week? Can't wait to see you again." There were no names, no details, just vague phrases that could have been innocent in another context. But I knew better. The tone of the messages, paired with what I'd seen, left no doubt. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding as I tried to piece it together. Was it him? Was this the man from the daycare? The messages stopped weeks ago, but their existence told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a one-time slip or an innocent mistake. This was planned, calculated. Francesca came back into the kitchen, humming to herself, none the wiser. I placed the phone back exactly as I'd found it, forcing myself to act normal. She glanced at me briefly, smiling in that easy, thoughtless way she always did. I didn't smile back. Whoever he was, I would find him. And when I did, there would be no hiding. The pieces started to come together slowly, almost maddeningly so. I couldn't let Francesca suspect anything, so I kept my investigation quiet, piecing together every shred of information I could remember. It hit me one morning while getting Noah ready for school. I thought back to his innocent comment a few weeks ago, the one that had first planted doubt in my mind. He'd mentioned a man, someone who'd picked him up once. Curious, I casually asked Noah if he remembered the man's name. Without hesitation, he said, "Eric." Eric. The name hung in the air, and suddenly, the cryptic texts from Francesca's phone had context. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral. I praised Noah for his memory and moved on, my mind already racing. Later that evening, I cross-referenced the name against the daycare's list of parents. It didn't take long to find Eric. His name was listed alongside his son, who was in Noah's group. I didn't recognize the name, but I did recognize the man. It was him. From there, it wasn't hard to uncover more. Social media painted a picture of Eric Mathers as a polished, charming family man. His posts showed him at charity events, family outings, and professional gatherings. His wife, Lila, appeared in many of them, a poised, elegant woman who was apparently well known in the business community. Lila's profile told me more. She owned a successful interior design firm and was active in local organizations, often praised for her leadership and philanthropy. The image of a perfect couple. The more I dug, the angrier I became. Eric wasn't just some random fling. He was entrenched in the same community Francesca moved through. He wasn't a stranger. He was someone she'd chosen deliberately, someone who had a lot to lose. I stared at their pictures, the smiling family facade, and felt the weight of my anger shift into something colder, sharper. Eric wasn't untouchable, and neither was Francesca. Once I knew who Eric was, I realized his wife, Lila, was the key to breaking this wide open. If Eric had as much to lose as it seemed, Francesca wasn't the only one spinning a web of lies. Lila deserved to know the truth, and frankly, her reaction might tell me more about Eric than I could uncover on my own. I approached her carefully. Under the pretense of discussing an upcoming daycare event, I reached out, suggesting we meet for coffee. She agreed without hesitation, her tone warm but professional. When we met, Lila was exactly as I'd imagined. Polished, poised, and disarmingly sharp. She carried herself with an air of control, the kind of person who could handle anything thrown her way. We started with small talk about the kids and daycare activities, but I could see her sizing me up, wondering why I'd asked for this meeting. I eased into the conversation, mentioning how active Francesca had been with the committee and how it seemed she and Eric had worked closely together. At the mention of Eric's name, Lila's demeanor shifted slightly. Her smile stayed in place, but there was a flicker of something. Uncertainty, maybe even suspicion. She nodded along but said little, her responses cautious. Pushing forward, I brought up a vague concern about Francesca and Eric spending time together outside of daycare. I framed it as curiosity rather than an accusation, watching Lila closely. That's when I saw it. A brief flash of something in her eyes, recognition, maybe even dread. I've noticed Eric's been different lately, she said finally, her words carefully chosen. He's been coming home late more often. Says it's work, but... She trailed off, her hesitation confirming everything I suspected. That was my moment. I took out my phone, scrolling to the messages I'd found on Francesca's device, and slid it across the table. I think you deserve to know the truth, I said, keeping my voice low but firm. Lila's eyes widened as she read the texts. Her composure wavered, her hand trembling slightly as she set the phone down. For a moment, she didn't speak, staring past me as if trying to process what she was seeing. When she finally looked up, there was no trace of the polished, poised woman who had greeted me. Instead, I saw anger, hurt, and a grim determination. This explains a lot, she said quietly. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what we now shared hanging between us. Then, Lila straightened, her expression hardening. What do you want to do about this? She asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her jaw. It was clear she wasn't going to sweep this under the rug. Lila wasn't the kind of woman to let something like this slide, and in that moment, I realized we were on the same side. We exposed them, I said. Lila nodded, her gaze fierce. Let's make sure they can't hide from this. This wasn't just about my family anymore, it was about hers too. Together, we would make sure Francesca and Eric paid for their betrayal. I confronted Francesca late that evening, the house quiet except for the hum of the fridge. Noah was asleep, his peaceful innocence a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the room. I started calmly, laying out what I knew. The texts, the time she spent with Eric, and the undeniable fact that I had seen them together. For a moment, she froze, her expression a mixture of fear and shock, but it didn't last. She broke down almost instantly, tears streaming as she spiraled between hysterics and excuses. She denied it at first, claiming I must have misinterpreted what I'd seen, that it wasn't what I thought. When that didn't work, she turned defensive, accusing me of spying on her, of violating her privacy. You're paranoid, Pete. You're imagining things, she shouted, her voice cracking. When I didn't waver, she shifted again, trying to justify her actions. She blamed me for being distant, for working too much, for not giving her enough attention. Every excuse she threw my way only deepened my disgust. Finally, she resorted to minimizing the affair entirely. It was a one-time mistake, she cried, her voice shrill and desperate. It didn't mean anything. I stared at her, unmoved by her theatrics. The evidence spoke louder than her words ever could. She wasn't crying out of remorse. She was crying because she'd been caught. You chose this, Francesca, I said coldly, and now you'll deal with the consequences. Her sobs turned to anger, but I didn't stay to hear more. I left her standing there, a mess of tears and excuses, and walked away. I had no intention of arguing with her anymore. I had a plan, and nothing she said would derail it. The daycare parent-teacher gathering was an ideal stage. It was formal enough to draw a crowd, but informal enough to avoid suspicion. Lila and I had coordinated carefully, ensuring the timing and setting would leave no room for Francesca or Eric to escape unscathed. The event was in full swing when it happened. Lila, with her characteristic poise, approached Eric in front of several parents and teachers, her voice calm but sharp as she laid out the details of his betrayal. The color drained from his face as the words hit him, his attempts to deflect faltering under the weight of her accusations. Francesca, standing nearby, froze as the confrontation unfolded. Her wide eyes darted toward me, then back to Eric, as if searching for an escape. But before she could slip away, I stepped forward, addressing the growing crowd. "This isn't just about Eric," I said, my tone steady but cutting. "Francesca is just as involved. They've been carrying on this affair for months, lying to everyone around them." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, eyes darting between Francesca and Eric. Francesca, unable to hold her composure, erupted in hysteria. She screamed that I was sabotaging her, accusing me of ruining her reputation out of spite. She claimed it was all lies, that I was manipulating everyone to hurt her. Her words didn't matter. The texts I presented, evidence of their affair, silenced any doubts. The room was tense, filled with the weight of her lies unraveling in real time. Parents who had once admired Francesca's dedication to the daycare now looked at her with disgust and pity. Eric tried to intervene, his voice shaking as he attempted to defend Francesca and himself, but it was useless. The evidence was too damning, and the damage was done. By the end of the night, Francesca and Eric were left standing alone, their reputations in shreds. The carefully constructed facades they had built crumbled in front of everyone they thought they could fool. As I walked out of the room, I didn't feel triumph, just a cold sense of justice. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. The fallout wasn't over, but this was the beginning of their end. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift and brutal. Eric's picture-perfect family shattered within days. Lila, unrelenting in her determination, filed for divorce almost immediately. Her decisive action left Eric scrambling to salvage what he could, but there was no undoing the damage. She took their child and moved into her parents' home, cutting Eric out of their lives as much as the law allowed. His professional reputation, tied to the same community that now whispered about his infidelity, began to crumble as clients and colleagues distanced themselves. Francesca, meanwhile, fared no better. The parents at the daycare turned cold, their previous admiration for her dedication now replaced with scorn. Invitations to coffee dates, playdates, and committee meetings disappeared overnight. Whispers followed her everywhere, and even Noah's teachers seemed to avoid her. She was isolated, reduced to a shadow of her once vibrant presence. I served her with divorce papers a week later. She reacted with stunned disbelief, as though she hadn't anticipated this outcome. When she tried to plead with me, saying we could rebuild, I shut her down. "There's nothing left to rebuild, Francesca," I told her firmly. "You destroyed it all." The words hung heavy in the air, and I saw the briefest flicker of realization in her eyes. Still, she signed the papers, but I could feel her resentment simmering beneath the surface. For a time, things seemed to settle. Francesca stayed in the house while I arranged for new living accommodations, and I focused on keeping life as normal as possible for Noah. But then her anger began to manifest. It started small, sharp comments, subtle digs about my parenting, but soon escalated. One evening, she made her intentions clear. She declared that she wouldn't let me take Noah from her, accusing me of being controlling and emotionally abusive. I didn't respond. Her words were hollow, an attempt to regain power she no longer held. But Francesca wasn't done. She began leveraging her remaining connections, twisting the narrative among daycare parents to portray herself as the victim of an overbearing husband. She claimed I'd driven her to make mistakes and wasn't fit to care for Noah. I heard the rumors filtering back, whispers of how poor Francesca was trying to protect her child from a man who had controlled her for years. It was infuriating, but I stayed calm, knowing her lies wouldn't hold up against the truth. The final straw came when Francesca announced she was filing for full custody. She claimed she was planning to leave the country, taking Noah to live closer to her family abroad. She spoke of giving him a better life, implying that my presence in his life was somehow detrimental. Hearing her say it made my blood run cold. This wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of war. She might have thought she could outmaneuver me, but she underestimated my resolve. Francesca could fight me all she wanted, but Noah wasn't going anywhere. I wouldn't let her take him, and I wouldn't let her get away with this. Francesca's arrogance made her reckless. She believed her manipulation would corner me into submission, that I would relent and allow her to take Noah abroad. But while she was busy spinning her web of lies, I was building something far more intricate. I reached out to Alex, a close friend I'd known for years. Alex worked in international logistics, a field where knowing the right people could open or close doors anywhere in the world. When I told him what Francesca was planning, he didn't hesitate to help. "She wants to leave the country?" he said, leaning back in his chair, his tone already sharp with purpose. "Then let's make sure she gets exactly what she's asking for." We devised the plan carefully. I played the part of the reluctant but resigned husband, telling Francesca I was willing to try her idea for Noah's sake. I suggested a trial period abroad, where she could take Noah to her so-called family while we sorted out custody. Francesca didn't question it. She thought she'd won. Meanwhile, Alex pulled strings. He arranged for Francesca to fly to a remote country in Southeast Asia, far removed from the safety net she believed would support her. I allowed Francesca to handle the arrangements, knowing Alex had already intercepted them. He booked her flight and coordinated with one of his local contacts, a fixer who specialized in making people disappear, not in a violent way but in the bureaucratic sense. The day Francesca left, she was all confidence and smug satisfaction. She barely looked at me as she kissed Noah goodbye, promising they'd be together again soon. I let her go without a word, my silence masking the storm brewing beneath. When her plane landed, the trap snapped shut. As planned, Francesca discovered almost immediately that her return ticket had been canceled. Her attempts to access her bank accounts failed. Alex had drained the accounts she controlled, funneling the money into an unreachable holding account. Her phone, which she relied on for communication, was remotely disabled, leaving her stranded with no way to call for help. The final blow came when her passport vanished. Our fixer ensured it was quietly stolen, leaving Francesca with no identification and no way to leave the country. By the time she realized what had happened, she was trapped in a foreign land with no resources, no connections, and no way back. The world she had counted on to support her crumbled, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. I received a brief update from Alex the next day. "She's stuck," he said simply, "and she won't be going anywhere unless we say so." I didn't feel guilt, only satisfaction. Francesca had tried to destroy my life, to tear Noah away from me and rewrite the truth. Now she could face the consequences of her choices. Back home, I filed for full custody, citing abandonment and Francesca's attempt to flee the country as evidence of her instability. With her gone, the legal process was swift and decisive. Noah was safe, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight begin to lift. Francesca had wanted freedom, and I had given it to her. Just not in the way she expected.